Hey there, all you horror hounds. Welcome back to Crypt Finder. So, I'm going to take a little bit of a pause on the series that I'm doing right now as far as made for TV horror movies, just classics in that particular genre, because I wanted to do this particular video. It's just sinking my fangs basically into my favorite subject, which is Dracula. So, grab your garlic, your crucifixes. The crypt is very dark and eerie tonight, just the way the Count likes it. So, we're going to take a look at some of the great and some of the not so great actual screen adaptations from Bram Stoker's classic masterpiece, Dracula. If you're here, you probably already know who Count Dracula is and the gist of his story, so I will spare you a recap of the entire book and everything. I will probably be pointing out some elements of things in the novel compared to some of the changes that might have happened in some of those big screen adaptations. So, yeah, be prepared for that. But for the most part, yeah, you don't have to read the book necessarily to watch this video. I might be a little biased. It is my favorite book. And so, yes, I think that you should read it because, as I said, it's just a classic of Gothic horror. But it's not a prerequisite that you've read it to enjoy this video. I personally think that one of the most fascinating things about Count Dracula is how you have the character within the novel, which is very different than sort of the pop cultural icon that the figure of Count Dracula has become in modern day society, because he's in books and movies and TV series and comics, and so much that's been expanded upon Stoker's work in so many ways. And the film adaptations more closely linked to the novel often take a lot of creative liberties. There are characters that are completely reimagined. There are plot points that are shifted, settings are altered, and sometimes those changes really help streamline the story and really give it kind of a laser focus in a way. And then there are other times it results in this very chaotic mix of character names being changed, rearranged relationships, and some very wild plot point deviations. Initially, I planned to rank these just from worst to best, but that proved incredibly difficult. I mean, you would need an Excel spreadsheet where you're ticking boxes like this element is found in the novel, and then this element is also found in this particular film. And it started to become basically my least favorite subject, which is math. So instead, I just jettisoned all that and I grouped all of these based on category and just kind of went from there. I will say one thing for all you purists out there, and I know who you are, and believe me, I hear you. I decided not to cover Nosferatu at all. F.W. Murnau's 1922 classic, Nosferatu. It's an amazing film. I absolutely adore it. I do think that it truly is just a masterpiece of horror. I really enjoy Werner Herzog's 1979 remake of Nosferatu. I saw that in the theater in 79. Really enjoyed it. And because I don't know when you'll actually get to see this particular video, because it might take me a while to work on this one, but at least as of the time that I'm recording it, we're past Christmas 2025, and I have seen Robert Eggers' just incredible remake of Nosferatu. Just a fantastic film. I think if you are a vampire fan, you absolutely should see that movie because he's taken the basics of that story and just sort of reimagined them into this kind of fever dream nightmare that is just terrific. And he's taken the sort of gothic old school vampire and actually made it scary again, which is awesome. So yes, All of those are very, very just terrific films, and I think that you should absolutely see them. But the purpose of Nosferatu, when Murnau originally was approaching this, was to veer as far away from the novel Dracula as much as possible. He was trying to avoid any sort of like copyright infringement lawsuits that might arise, and so he purposely changed the names and the locations and a lot of the elements of the story, and it didn't do him any good, of course. Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, ended up suing him, and she won, and it basically bankrupted the entire film company, and all copies were supposed to be destroyed. Thankfully, one survived, and we have that one today. So all of those films have tried to go so far away from Stoker's novel, you can't really even call them true adaptations of the book. So that's why I decided not to cover those whatsoever. So if you're looking for that in this particular list, I decided to just sort of slide that over to the side. I might do another video sometime actually comparing the different film iterations of Nosferatu, because they are fascinating just within their own right. Please let me know down in the comments if that is something that you're interested in, and I'll certainly try to tackle it. But for right now, okay, just hold on. It is going to be a very bumpy carriage ride through the Carpathian Mountains. So let's go. Let's actually talk about some of the best and not so great screen adaptations of Bram Stoker's classic novel, Dracula. So the first category we're going to dive into is modern interpretations. This is where they've taken all the sort of basic plot points of Stoker's novel, although sometimes rearranged, and they've actually incorporated into a modern setting, which I never really minded all that much. You have to remember that when Dracula was first published in 1897, it was a modern novel, and it had all of the sort of modern trappings of 1890s London. You had the typewriter, the portable typewriter, phonograph, telegraphs, things that were very much part of the modern world, but you had a very ancient evil sort of spreading across London. So I've never really minded when filmmakers like try to take the core elements of Dracula and move them up into a modern setting. But the first one that I want to talk about is a film called Dracula Reborn. Now, there's several different movies that have this title. The one that I'm referring to is actually from 2012, and it stars Corey Landis, Stuart Rigby. It's directed by Patrick McManus. In this adaptation, Jonathan Harker is a real estate agent selling property in Los Angeles to Vladimir Sarkany. He's actually Count Dracula. He's never explicitly named as such in the script, but we know who he is. The script has its ups and downs. The acting is a little bit of a mixed bag here, but as far as an interpretation of Stoker's novel, it ticks all the right boxes. Reviews are all over the place for this one. I've actually read some people who think this is the worst adaptation of Stoker's novel that they've ever seen. Other people sort of appreciate kind of the fun, the campy kind of experience that the filmmakers were going for in this one, and I'm definitely in the latter camp. I genuinely like this movie. Keeping Dracula's motivations unclear for buying a warehouse in a very seedy part of LA, that's kind of intriguing. It mirrors the novel's ambiguity just a little bit. We always have to just assume that Dracula came to England for conquest, but yeah, it's never really clearly explained, and it's not explained in this film either. Corey Landis, he offers a very fresh take on Jonathan Harker here. He portrays him as a husband grappling with the prospect of fatherhood and its impact on his life, his career. Stuart Rigby is very convincing as Dracula. Yeah, you've got some of the early 2000s CGI, so when he starts to vamp out, it's noticeable. It's just not really that distracting. Making Lucy, Jonathan, and Hawkins all realtors, that ties them together actually nicely. It justifies their presence within the story. Yes, there are some valid complaints. I understand. Van Helsing, he's way too young. Lena, who's sort of the stand-in for Mina, you have sort of this love story being brought in over and over again, which is nowhere within the novel, of course. And, Sarkany's British accent, It sort of doesn't really make sense with his Eastern European name, but again, those are just minor quibbles. Look, it's important to appreciate the film for exactly what it is, a low-key adaptation of Stoker's novel. It hits all the essential beats. You can see the filmmaker's dedication, certainly. No, you probably won't love it, but as a modern reimagining of Stoker's work, yeah, it's worth a watch. If you're a true aficionado, you're going to have to probably watch it at some point. Otherwise, you'll just be kicked out of the Vampire Union. Next is Dracula's Curse. Now, much like Dracula Reborn, there are multiple films that share that particular title, but the one that I'm referring to is actually the Italian miniseries from 2002. It's directed by Roger Young and it stars Patrick Bergin. The series was later cobbled together into a film called Dracula's Curse, whereas the miniseries was originally just called Dracula or El Bacio de Dracula, The Kiss of Dracula. I've seen both versions, and I don't know if one is going to give you a much more heightened viewing experience than the other. The original miniseries, okay, it takes its time. It definitely allows for some breathing room and a little bit deeper character development. And so I think if you're a die-hard Dracula fan, that's probably the one that you will end up seeking out. But the film Dracula's Curse is also much more readily available, so it doesn't matter. Any way that you see it is perfectly fine, and it's both of them fall under our modern interpretation category here. In this version, Jonathan Harker is a young American lawyer. He proposes to his girlfriend, Mina, and he already has plans for all of their friends, Lucy, Quincy, and Arthur, to be in Budapest when he proposes, so they'll be there for the wedding celebrations. But at the same time, Jonathan is suddenly hired by a very wealthy client to inventory his uncle's estate, which takes him deep into Romania to visit Count Vladislav Tepish. And the Count, who's planning to leave his home, he ultimately wants Jonathan to broker this deal to turn all of his art and all of his antiquities into cold hard cash. An interesting twist here is that Dracula appears both as the wealthy and reclusive Count, and he also appears as the younger version of himself as his nephew. Dracula ultimately seduces all of the characters within the film, mostly for the idea that they can have wealth and power and great prestige as long as they ultimately give him their immortal soul. It's no surprise that an Italian series would sort of link Dracula so closely to the devil, who is offering to trade a flawed sort of eternal life without conscience for the very sort of strict Catholicism of faith and morality. The acting can be a bit weak at times. Some of the CGI falls pretty flat. And Patrick Bergin, I don't know, he seems a little too reserved in his portrayal of Dracula. None of the intensity that you would have seen from his character in the film Sleeping with the Enemy is really present here. He's definitely very low key. Yet, as a modern interpretation of Stoker's work, yeah, it remains pretty intriguing. And when I say modern, I mean, yes, it is updated, but it also features horses and carriages and tries to retain some of the Gothic elements as well. This movie, I've got to give them props. They even find a way, even though Jonathan Harker takes his sports car deep into the Carpathian Mountains, ultimately, by the time he gets to the castle, the filmmakers find a really clever way of getting him into 19th century clothing for the time that he's there, which is okay. I got to give him props for that. It's a very clever idea. So, if you're looking for a version of Dracula that intertwines horror with a moral battle, then yes, Dracula's Curse might just be your next watch. It's another take on Stoker's classic, blending the contemporary themes with a dash of Italian flair. Next, we're going to venture into television adaptations, and this is a much more robust category as far as direct adaptations of Stoker's novel to the screen. But I'm going to start off with really one of the weakest in this particular grouping, and it's the 2006 BBC production of Dracula, starring Mark Warren. Now, this adaptation is technically an attempt at Stoker's novel, but the variations are really just so liberal that it kind of ends up missing the mark on the thrills, the excitement, and frankly, even the character dynamics of the original novel. It does deliver a very unique revision that just, in the end, oh, how do I say it? It fails spectacularly. The premise is that Arthur Holmwood, he's played by a very young Dan Stevens, he brings Dracula to England to cure his syphilis so he can ultimately consummate his marriage to Lucy. It's intriguing. I mean, that premise is very different, but ultimately very, very misguided. The acting is wooden, the characters deviate drastically from their book counterparts, and the inclusion of a cult that sort of worships Dracula, it feels more like some sort of forced homage to Hammer's film Kiss of the Vampire than it really relates to anything in Stoker's book. The entire production feels very lackluster here. It falls very short of expectations. The ending is very uninspiring. It actually seems to set up maybe a potential sequel that ultimately just never materialized. If you're on a mission to see every adaptation of Dracula ever created, okay, add it to your watch list. Otherwise, yeah, you probably just want to skip this one altogether. So that's the 2006 BBC production of Dracula, a film that it reaches for the stars, but ultimately it just falls flat, and it really kind of leaves you really sort of craving the charm and the suspense of the original novel instead. From 2021, we have actually the minds behind the series Sherlock, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, and they decided to take a very fresh approach to Dracula. They brought this to BBC One, and then later it became a three-part installment on Netflix. The format really suits the story very well, with the first episode delivering a fairly traditional version of the novel's initial chapters. You have Jonathan Harker trapped within Castle Dracula and his subsequent escape. However, it deviates from Stoker's work quite a bit. It introduces the idea that Dracula not only consumes blood, but can also gain all of the knowledge from his victims, and can even take on their likenesses. Episode 2 then begins to transform the Demeter into a passenger ship, and Dracula's wreaking havoc among the passengers and the crew. Episode 3 finds Dracula snoozing at the bottom of Whitby Harbor in one of his earth-filled crates until he is revived and brought into modern-day England. So if all of this sounds sort of off the wall, yeah, it is actually. In the novel, Dracula can't cross water except at slack or flood of tide. So having him inside one of his earth boxes down at the bottom of the North Sea would have actually meant complete destruction. So that doesn't really make sense in comparison to the book. Claes Bang does an admirable job as the Count. He brings sort of this fresh, charismatic energy to the role. However, the infusion of sort of campy humor among all of the bloodshed ends up distracting from a story that might benefit from a jolt of new blood. Unfortunately, this adaptation just sort of falls flat. Despite its bold attempts at reinvention, it's a wild ride. It just veers so far from Stoker's original. It just kind of leaves you with a mix of horror and humor. It just doesn't quite hit the mark. If you're curious about a modern twist on the classic tale, give it a watch. Otherwise, yeah, you might want to just stick to more traditional adaptations. Next on the list is an adaptation of Dracula from the Mystery and Imagination series in 1968. Unfortunately, a lot of this series has been lost over time, including their interpretation of Carmilla, which was Sheridan Le Fanu's classic vampire tale from 1872. But at least we did have this version of Dracula survive, so we can still see it today. As always, this adaptation is sort of loosely based on Stoker's novel, but it makes some very intriguing choices to compress the novel's massive scope to fit a small screen runtime. This adaptation mimics some of the Hamilton Dean John Balterston 1920s Broadway version of Dracula, that play, because it starts off with Dracula already well ensconced in England. There are some odd mashups here, though, such as the entire story takes place in Whitby. In the novel, of course, Whitby is it's just this little North Yorkshire town where the ship the Dracula is on, the Demeter, crashes into the harbor there. His crates are handed off to a solicitor who ultimately just ships them to London and from there to his estate Carfax in Purfleet. So you think that Renfield is in Dr. Seward's sanitarium. He's labeled as patient 34. Oh, sorry. If you don't know who Renfield is, pause this, go and Google him real quick and look him up, and then come back. So typically within the novel and within most film adaptations, certainly Renfield, R.M. Renfield, is the one who is in Dr. Seward's sanitarium. In this version, it turns out it's Jonathan Harker. He's gone completely mad from his experiences in Transylvania, and he now starts to fill the Renfield role. There are flashbacks showing what happened to him, making for kind of an interesting transposition there. Denham Elliott plays Dracula here. He sports a goatee. He also has sort of the Nosferatu, two sharp teeth right in front, but this production really just suffers from a lack of locales. It primarily takes place in the asylum and a cemetery, giving it sort of the feel of like it's a stage play. However, it does feature Mr. Swales. He's a character often ignored in adaptations of Stoker's work. You can certainly see the influence of Hammer Films' The Horror of Dracula in the conclusion of this film. It's a unique, if somewhat constrained take on Stoker's classic with some fascinating character twist and minimalist setting. It feels more like theater than film. It's worth a watch for its historical value and unique approach to the story. Now we're going to take a little trip to 1973 for a very unique production. This is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Purple Playhouse production of Dracula. This version features Norman Welsh as Dracula, and well, let me tell you, his portrayal is unforgettable, complete with a British accent and fangs that are huge. It makes him look like a walrus. Now, imagine trying to cram all of Bram Stoker's sort of sprawling gothic epic into a single hour. Yep, a lot of the story gets jettisoned right out that carriage window. We lose Renfield, Arthur, Quincy. Instead, we sort of focus on a pared down cast with just Jonathan, Mina, Lucy, and Van Helsing. We get just two vampire women haunting the castle instead of three. Blair Brown steps into the role of Mina. She delivers a performance that's genuinely pretty convincing overall. But the rest of the cast, well, overacting is the name of the game here. And you know what? The filmmakers seem to really revel in it. Instead of modernizing any of Stoker's language for the audience of 1973, they just throw themselves headfirst into a lurid Victorian melodrama. It's like they decided, like, okay, well, if we can't be subtle, we might as well be as grandiose as possible. One outstanding feature is you do sort of see Dracula scuttling down the castle walls, and that really hadn't been done very much in film. Later on, we will get to Dracula in Istanbul, which does feature a scene like that. And also, you had a very quick glimpse of that in Scars of Dracula. Christopher Lee kind of walks up the castle walls. But this was really the first time in a TV adaptation to show Dracula crawling down the walls, very much mirroring what's in the novel. For years, this production was considered lost to sort of the sands of time, but good news for us, parts of it have resurfaced on YouTube. Unfortunately, there is a chunk missing, as evidenced by a gap in the timestamps. I'd love to see the entire thing, but for now, we will definitely make do with what we have available online. So if you're up for a wild, melodramatic ride through Dracula's world with a big old honking set of fangs to go with it, then please seek out this 1973 production. It's interesting, I think. It's a bizarre but fascinating chapter in the history of Dracula adaptations brought to screen. Next, we have one of the standout TV adaptations of Dracula from 1974. It's Dan Curtis's production here, starring the very formidable Jack Palance in the title role. So I think whether you enjoy this version or not is really going to come down to if you can appreciate what Palance is bringing. And some people find his portrayal way too brutish and it's not aristocratic enough. Others appreciate this unique take. It sort of balances between subtle moments and then very intense scenery chewing. Personally, I find Palance's performance pretty compelling here. His height and his strength give sort of a towering presence over his co-stars. His gravelly voice shifts from sort of the thunderous boom to a very menacing kind of hiss. I think it adds layers to the portrayal of the Count. Dan Curtis was, of course, best known for the ABC TV soap opera Dark Shadows, but in the late 60s and into the 70s, he sort of began to branch out. He began taking sort of classic novels and adapting those for a TV audience. His repertoire of reimaginings included titles like Frankenstein, The Turn of the Screw, and also The Picture of Dorian Gray. Palance and Curtis had previously teamed up in 1968 for the TV adaptation of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but here their collaboration really provided much stronger results. This production benefits from the atmospheric settings of England and Yugoslavia. It's brought to life by Oswald Morris's stunning cinematography. The screenplay, which was penned by the legendary Richard Matheson, who I've talked about so much on this particular channel, but here he introduces a very fresh twist to the familiar tale. Matheson and Curtis draw inspiration, obviously, from the lovelorn vampire Barnabas Collins of Dark Shadows, making Dracula's journey to England a quest to find Lucy Westerner, who bears this uncanny resemblance to his long-lost love. This layer of romantic tragedy, it adds some depth to the story, which was a very interesting idea at the time that had not yet become a cliche. You really didn't see so much of Dracula like pining after his lost love. This was the film that really began to ignite that in the public's imagination. Matheson's script meticulously builds Dracula's motivations. His pursuit of Lucy and her ultimate transformation into a vampire and then her destruction, that's what fuels his rage and ultimately leads to sort of his revenge that he begins to take out on Mina. So story-wise, the motivations all sort of make sense. Palance really taps into this sort of pathos. He delivers a performance. It's both savage and it's kind of tinged with a little bit of sadness, but never really descending into melodrama. Another groundbreaking element in this production of Dracula is the actual linkage between Count Dracula and then the historical Vlad Tepes III, who was called Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula. That had been hinted at and certainly explored in very minute ways in film before, never quite this way. And some of that had to do with the fact that in 1972 there was a very groundbreaking book called In Search of Dracula by Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu that really explored that more. And so this film began to sort of tackle that. Curtis and Matheson cleverly began to integrate this concept to sort of enrich their narrative. There are notable deviations here, though, from Stoker's novel. Jonathan Harker's fate is somewhat different. You also have the idea of Dr. Seward and Renfield just completely jettisoned from this particular story. Additionally, the traditional shape-shifting into bats and wolves, that's abandoned in favor of a much more realistic portrayal. This Dracula is very physical. He doesn't seem to have powers beyond immortality and strength and hypnotic ability. And despite these changes, this adaptation remains fairly faithful to Stoker's work, with shifts in motivation and character adjustments, ultimately really, I think, enhancing the story rather than distracting from it. In summary, this 1974 adaptation, it's a pretty compelling watch. With Jack Palance's imposing performance, you've got Matheson's thoughtful script, you have Curtis's atmospheric direction. It really stands out as one of the better TV interpretations of Dracula. If you haven't seen it yet, it's definitely worth checking out. Okay, so now we're going to move into theatrical adaptations of Dracula. And I have to start off with it's one I don't want to go into. In fact, the least said about it, the better. But it is Dario Argento's Dracula from 2012. So, again, I have to talk about it. It is at least tangentially connected enough to Stoker's work to call it an adaptation, so I've got to mention it. But as I said, this is not a really good film. It's not something you should seek out. I didn't see it in the original 3D, so maybe when that element was removed, it actually hurt the film in some ways because a lot of the CGI looks really, really rough. And I mean rough as in more like late 90s video game rough. The performances are not good. The direction's not good. And I can certainly appreciate the fact that Dracula in the novel has control over some of the lesser animals of the earth, and he shapeshifts himself into a bat and a wolf. But in this film, having him shapeshift into a giant praying mantis to rip off a guy's head, it's a little off the charts. Maybe I should say that for you again. He turns into a giant praying mantis. Okay. So that's it. I really am not going to belabor that one too much. Okay, so instead, let's move on to another film. A much more interesting take. It's from 1953, and it's one I mentioned a little bit earlier back, Dracula in Istanbul. So remember when I mentioned the idea of Vlad the Impaler in relation to Dan Curtis's version earlier on in the TV adaptation section? Well, here's where that concept was first explored on film. This movie is based on the 1928 novel by Ali Risa Sefid, and it's actually entitled Kazikli Vovoda. It's not a direct translation of Stoker's work. It's much more like a very liberal reimagining of Stoker's work, but much more suited toward a Muslim audience. In this version, all of the normal trappings that you would find to repel a vampire, such as crosses or holy wafers or holy water, all of those things are switched out for copies of the Quran to actually repel the vampires. The characters get Turkish makeovers too. Jonathan Harker becomes Azmi, Lucy is Sadan, and Mina is now named Guzin, and she is a showgirl in sort of skimpy outfits who breaks into dance numbers here and there. Yes, you heard me right. Mina, the Mina character, actually is a showgirl. Yeah, okay, just go with it. Despite all these changes, Dracula is still portrayed as Vlad the Impaler, and the choice actually makes perfect sense, given that Vlad Tepes III, who again was known as Vlad the Impaler, he notoriously slaughtered thousands of Turks during his reign. So, resurrecting this historical figure and actually turning him into the vampire that moves into here, not London, but modern day Istanbul, would have been a very chilling concept for Turkish audiences at the time. Dracula in Istanbul could easily be categorized as a modern reimagining because, again, it does take place in 1950s Turkey. However, it really stays very true to many of Stoker's cues and retains enough of the original events and characters to stand as an intriguing, albeit somewhat simplified adaptation. So, for example, Gone or Renfield, there's no Dr. Seward in this version, there's no sanatorium. The Count prowls his castle with only one female vampire by his side, but there is a servant character that's been added as well. You'll still find Dracula. He turns into a bat in this one. He also appears and disappears in clouds of smoke. But very noticeable in this film is that outside of Nosferatu, this is the first time in film that Dracula actually sports fangs as well. So it makes it a little bit of a landmark as far as vampire film cinema goes. Atif Kopkin's portrayal of Dracula is admittedly a bit stiff, a little bit bland. He sports the classic tuxedos and tails and cape. He's very reminiscent of the Universal Bela Lugosi version of Dracula here, but there is an exception. You do see him actually crawling down the wall of his castle. He feeds an infant to his female vampire, and he's also subjected to both a staking and a beheading, and those are very bold moves. Universal Pictures in 1931 would have never gone that far. Dracula in Istanbul stands out not only for its cultural adaptation, but also for its daring interpretation of the classic vampire tale. I think it's an essential watch for anyone interested in the evolution of Dracula on screen because it's blending historical context with a very unique cultural perspective. Okay, let's set sail on the high seas with a theatrical release of Last Voyage of the Demeter from 2023. This is a really interesting film, has very high production values, and an amazing cast here with Corey Hawkins, Liam Cunningham and also David Dalsmatian. You might wonder why this film isn't ranked maybe a little bit higher in the Dracula adaptation category. And the reason for that is, well, it does an excellent job of adapting one chapter from Bram Stoker's novel, but that's it. So just adapting one chapter, it really can't be considered an adaptation of Stoker's entire novel, and that's why. This movie had a really interesting journey to the screen. The spec script I read floated around Hollywood for like 20 years before finally being made. It focuses on the doomed Russian merchant ship Demeter, which takes on crates of earth bound for England, and the crew is subsequently picked off one by one as the Count feeds, and he grows stronger the closer they get to the North Yorkshire coast. In many ways, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, it plays out a little bit like the movie Alien from 1979 because you have a crew of people who are stranded in the middle of nowhere and they're just being picked off one by one by one as they try to figure out the source of like what's actually going on. This also has just really terrific direction in it. The film works best, I think, when it keeps Dracula hidden. Holding off on Dracula's reveal even longer would have probably added even more suspense, especially since they opted for a much more bat-like monster than a humanoid version of the Count. There are some obvious Hollywood touches here that really stray away from the novel, such as, for example, having sunlight turn vampires into dust. That doesn't really happen in the book. Dracula moves about quite freely throughout London, except for the times that he has to be consigned to his earth box for like rejuvenation purposes. The idea of vampires turning into dust, that actually originated way on back with Nosferatu in 1922 in Murnau's attempt to distinguish his film from Stoker's novel. That was a really interesting way of Count Orlok meeting his demise. And it's funny too because in film, I mean, even by the mid 1940s, early to mid 40s, certainly with House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula from Universal, and then even Son of Dracula, for example, in all of those films, the Count was destroyed by daylight. So it's funny how only a little over 20 years or so since Murnau's film came out, suddenly that became just canon and has been used ever since. That daylight will destroy a vampire. Sir, I definitely understand it for film purposes because that can be some really, amazing shots with great special effects. So I totally understand it. It's just not in the novel. And so for them to incorporate it into this movie, okay. Again, we go with it. We just roll with those punches. Additionally, in the novel, Dracula needed to ensure that those crates reached land because he couldn't cross water except at slack or flood of tide, as I've mentioned previously in this video. So it really doesn't work. This movie decided to kind of ignore some of those elements, and instead they have some very dazzling visual flying sequences that work, but it doesn't really hold true because if Dracula could actually just fly out, he could have ignored any danger that was present to him at the conclusion of the film. He could have just flown himself over to English soil and landed safely. So that doesn't quite work. Another thing, and I've got to mention it here, there is no such place as Carfax Abbey. There's no abbey connected to it. So back when Universal was making the 1931 Dracula with Bela Lugosi, they relied very heavily on the Broadway play script, which that's where that came from. They decided to call it Carfax Abbey and that. But in the novel, that doesn't really happen. It can be called, I guess, Carfax House or Carfax Estate, but there's no abbey connected to it. So I know it's a very, very petty thing that I'm mentioning right here, but you do see that. You do see that in one of the shipping labels. But you know what? This is a Universal film, so we'll just say it's an homage to the 1931 classic and go with that. Despite these quibbles, The Last Voyage of the Demeter is a gripping standalone version of one of Stoker's chapters, and just as an aside here, I have to say, I would go and see any film version of any chapter, single chapter, from Stoker's Dracula, so in the end, I'm not really quibbling all that much. So, if you're up for a claustrophobic, suspenseful tale of Dracula hunting down a ship's crew, The Last Voyage of the Demeter is definitely worth your time. It might not be like a full adaptation of Stoker's novel, but it's a very thrilling slice of what brings a fresh perspective to the Dracula legend. Up next, we have Jess Franco's 1970 film Count Dracula, starring the legendary Christopher Lee. This one's a bit tricky to rank, and here's why. It strives to be a more faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel, but it takes significant liberty and really it just falls short of its potential. Christopher Lee was reportedly sort of enticed into making this movie because it was going to be a much more faithful interpretation of the novel, but there were budgetary constraints, and so the filming in Czechoslovakia ended up moving to Spain, which then ended up moving to Italy, and so you end up with this weird mismatch. It looks less like Transylvanian England, and it just has this odd continental flair to it. The cast should have delivered some incredible performances here. We have Herbert Lom as Van Helsing. Klaus Kinski plays Renfield. He would, of course, go on later, Klaus Kinski, to portray Count Dracula in Werner Herzog's 1979 remake of Nosferatu. And then you have Christopher Lee. He's taking a very fresh approach to Dracula, very distinct from any of his Hammer film portrayals of that character. Unfortunately, this film, it sinks like a lead balloon, and it strays pretty far from Stoker's novel, from the source material, in a lot of sort of unintentionally hilarious ways. So there's a scene in here where the vampire hunters arrive to destroy Dracula's crates of earth. They are met with these laughably unconvincing shots of taxidermied animals that are repositioned as if they are moving. Crew members are attempting to sort of animate them in some ways, but they really end up looking like exactly what they are. They're taxidermied animals, they're mounted to wooden bases, and they're clearly being pivoted and manipulated into shots to make them seem somehow more threatening. And yes, you have full permission right here to roll your eyes and bust out laughing. Despite the music and the zoom shots trying to add menace, this scene just drags on and fails to convince. And, Herbert Lom does a very fine job here as Van Helsing, but in some baffling departure from the novel, his character has a stroke midway through and is unable to actually go with the rest of the vampire hunters tracking Dracula back to Transylvania. I don't know why. A few points this adaptation gets right. Okay, it's the first time we see Dracula start as an older man and grow younger as he continues to feed. Unfortunately, by the end, though, Lee's hair looks like it's been coated in black shoe polish. Lee does deliver a very strong performance here. He's giving it his all, but something about, I don't know, the music, the direction, the pacing, it turns this film into a snooze fest. It's a shame because Stoker's novel is a very exciting, riveting story, yet this film languishes along like one of those bored taxidermied ferrets, just really needing to be put back on a shelf and left alone. In summary, Jess Franco's Count Dracula, it had all the ingredients for a really good film, but it ended up being a missed opportunity. So if you're a real Christopher Lee fan, then I guess this is worth a watch. Lower your expectations quite a bit because it's not the accurate version that it certainly boasted itself being. So in 1992, powerhouse director Francis Ford Coppola brought us Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'm probably getting ready to ruffle a lot of feathers right here, so just stay with me. If this happens to be your favorite version of Dracula, like you saw it at a very young, impressionable age, or you were just bowled over by the dazzling sort of visuals, I hear you. It is a very visually stunning film, but I just don't stop typing in the comments right now about how this is your favorite version and this movie is fantastic. Just bear with me as I go through and discuss the fact that yes, this is a very competent adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, but it's not the definitive one. So, okay, let's just start with what the movie gets right. There's a real nightmarish quality to this film that's spot on, frankly. The overlays of the Count's eyes across the Carpathian Mountains, the use of practical effects, the dripping style, all of those elements really coupled with a fantastic score, they really create a very atmospheric piece. This adaptation also uniquely incorporates the novel's epistolary style. So you see a lot of characters who are writing in their journals and their diaries and transcribing things on phonograph, which is really, really nice. You also have my favorite scene in the movie is where Dracula slides back into the darkness, and as they throw the lantern up, now he's become sort of a humanoid shape of rats that all fall to the floor and scurry away. Fantastic shot. And of course, the chase back to Transylvania as they're fighting against the setting sun. Very thrilling. All of that is very atmospheric, very well done. Now for the not so good part of it. Everything else. I'm sorry, but every single actor in this movie is way over the top. So it descends into melodrama pretty fast, which is a real shame. I remember at the time HBO, I think, aired like a behind the scenes. Some of the dress rehearsals had actually been filmed, and what you see there is really intense and really interesting. So, what happened there until we got to the finished product, I don't know. It's anyone's guess. It's just not as compelling as some of those early rehearsals. The costumes, despite winning an Academy Award, are totally anachronistic. It's resembling some sort of hodgepodge of different cultures and styles. The use of miniatures and forced perspectives is obvious, at least it is to me, that almost every single shot, save one, is on a soundstage. It looks like a very controlled environment instead of the sort of the wild, unpredictable world that it should be. I can hear all the complaints now, so let me finish. Just hold on for a second. All of those elements, those might be positives for you. They do add a dreamy, unrealistic kind of style reminiscent of stage performances, but for me, I just prefer less opera and more realism. And I know that sounds like a contradiction because you're talking about an ancient vampire prowling the streets of London, but for me, at least, when it's all style over substance, and there is a lot of substance in the book that gets kicked out of this film, but the result of that is it's just this bloated, stylized Hollywood film that really seems at odds, I guess, with some of the smaller art house horror movie touches that it's trying to incorporate. It feels super uneven. It ultimately removes the danger. There's no real sense of threat when it's all spectacle. Unlike some other adaptations, I really don't have a sense of like fear and anxiety for Mina and Lucy in this film. I think that Renfield is completely underdeveloped as far as a character. Tom Waits spends most of the film just sort of chomping on bugs and screaming maniacally in Romanian, and I do need to kind of clear up a misconception. Even though we've touched on this with some of these other film adaptations, there is nothing clearly stated in the book that Count Dracula is connected to any historical figure. Van Helsing does pose that theory after discussing with a friend of his at Budapest University in the novel, but it's never really confirmed. And Bram Stoker, even by chapter 25, he completely backtracks on that anyway. He has Mina and Dr. Seward and Van Helsing en route trying to apprehend or stop Dracula before he can get back to his castle. They all start going through Jonathan Harker's journal, all of the notes that he had made of what Dracula had said while he was imprisoned in the castle. So at that point, they're starting to think when Dracula refers to another in that lineage of another age, suddenly now he's talking about himself, and so which would have made him come way after Vlad Tepes III. So that's just something that filmmakers have that's a peg they've hung their hat on, which is not really factually correct. The introduction of Vlad Tepes and his wife's suicide that we see at the beginning of this film, that isn't in the book. The reincarnation angle, where we're now substituting Mina for Lucy, that's lifted right out of Matheson's script for the Dan Curtis 1974 version of Dracula we've already discussed. And that romance between Dracula and Mina, that is pure hogwash. None of that is in the novel. This isn't a faithful adaptation. Maybe about 60% of some of Stoker's writing actually finds its way into this film, and the rest of it is just completely made up hokum or severely altered. If you're after style, yeah, here it is. A gorgeous film that many treasure as a favorite. As an adaptation of the classic novel, it's just okay. Nevertheless, Bram Stoker's Dracula, it remains a visually stunning and memorable cinematic experience, even if it strays pretty far from the original source material. Now, in case you're screaming right now, like, well, what do you want? I mean, do you want like a page by page adaptation of the novel? And the answer is no, I wouldn't. Somebody somewhere figured out that if you tried to do that, it would be like a movie that would be over 1,000 hours long. It would be incredibly boring. No one would want to watch it. Well, I would watch it. But nevertheless, it's not important. What is important is that no, we don't want that. But there is still very fresh, innovative ways to approach Stoker's novel. And that really brings us to the next film from 1958. From the UK, it's Hammer Films' Horror of Dracula. This is not a faithful retelling of Stoker, far from it, actually, but it is a streamlined, energetic, thrilling version of the novel. British Hammer Studios, they had already really made their mark the previous year with Curse of Frankenstein by taking a very well-worn Universal property and avoiding any litigation by sort of returning to Mary Shelley's novel. The movie was in color, it was gruesome, with stellar production values, strong acting, directing, and it was an enormous hit. So they next turned their attention to Stoker's novel, and in a very different way, though. Renfield is gone, Dr. Seward's Sanatorium is out of this film, so is The Voyage of the Demeter. They've sort of reinvented the reason that Jonathan Harker even goes to the castle in the first place. It's to actually be Dracula's librarian and restore some priceless books, but he actually has another agenda. It turns out that Harker and Van Helsing are actually working in tandem. They are vampire hunters, and Jonathan Harker has been sent to the castle to actually discover if Dracula is indeed a vampire, and if so, to destroy him. Lucy here has been reworked as Jonathan's fiancée. Arthur Holmwood is husband to Mina, and Van Helsing is played by Peter Cushing with a panache, sort of an Errol Flynn swagger and this keen intellect. Van Helsing here is a scientist. He's studying the metaphysical and supernatural forces. The film removes the idea of vampires changing shape and roots their version of Dracula, much like Dan Curtis would do 15 years later, as a physical, terrifying, earthbound creature. The ending, of course, has sunlight doing all of the damage in a very famous sequence here. It's right out of Nosferatu, of course, and completely not out of the novel, but it is a thrilling ending to this film. It's got all the guts and glory that Hammer could manage, of course. This is a thrilling movie. It still manages to kind of hit all those beats, even when shifting the characters and the events and the motivations. Next, we're going to delve into a new category. It is stage to screen adaptations of Dracula. So up first is going to be Dracula, Pages from a Virgin's Diary. This is directed by Guy Madden. It's a sort of a low-budget gem. It's from the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. It premiered in 2002, bringing Stoker's novel to both stage and screen in a truly unique way. This was all shot in black and white. It's a silent film, just using title cards to present all of the information, sort of hearkening back to Nosferatu in some ways. And this adaptation here, it offers a very fresh retelling of the Dracula story in a very different format. One of the standout features here is the casting of Zhang Kwang, a Chinese-Canadian actor, as Dracula. This choice powerfully underscores Stoker's theme of xenophobia, adding a layer of depth to the narrative. Originally a stage ballet, Dracula Pages from a Virgin's Diary found its way to TV before being released theatrically in 2003. Its surreal approach might actually surprise you. If you are a fan of Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula and you have an appreciation of ballet, then I think this highly stylized version should be on your radar. The film's blending of ballet and silent cinema, it creates a dreamy, almost otherworldly atmosphere. You have elegant choreography, expressive performances to sort of convey this story's emotional and thematic way without the need for a lot of spoken dialogue. This adaptation does stay true to a lot of Stoker's concepts within his novel, and so if you're a fan of dance and certainly silent film, then I think that you might actually like this one. If you're open to a more avant-garde take, Dracula Pages from a Virgin's Diary, it offers a really mesmerizing, thought-provoking experience. It's really a testament, I guess, to the versatility of Stoker's story, proving that even a ballet can capture the horror, the romance, and all of the intrigue of the classic novel. The next one, unfortunately, is one we will never be able to see, so I won't belabor it too much, but it was NBC's matinee theater and starred John Carradine as Dracula. It was broadcast in color in 1956. This was a role he had played before, of course, in House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula for Universal. He would go on to reprise the role in subsequent film and television spots. The shot that you're looking at right now, that is not from this particular telefilm. That's just a publicity shot from one of John Carradine's performances in the stage play. Most people think this is circa probably around 1965-ish or so. Very little is known of this adaptation. So to say it is a stage to screen adaptation, that's probably not fair. We really don't know exactly. Certainly by the few newspaper articles of the time, it didn't seem like it was strictly a reworking of Stoker, and it wasn't so close to the Bela Lugosi Universal film for any lawyers to be involved, but it was only an hour time slot, so you have to imagine a large part of the novel had to be trimmed away, and given the confines of sort of a studio production at the time, it wouldn't be surprising if it borrowed very heavily from the Hamilton Dean John Balderston play, at least in some respects. There are indications in some of the articles that this did feature Jonathan Harker actually traveling to the castle. It featured the Demeter voyage to England and then back to the castle for the finale. So this might have actually been way less stagey than I'm imagining, and much more of a true adaptation. But frankly, it's lost to time now, and so we'll really never know. If any of you happen to be around in 1956 and you saw this on NBC, please let me know in the comments below what you thought of it. But it seems like it's pretty much lost to time now. Next up in our stage to screen adaptations of Dracula, we've got Universal Studios, their big budget 1979 version of Dracula starring Frank Langella. He was fresh off of the Broadway turn where he had just been reviving the Hamilton Dean John Balderston version with beautiful sets by Edward Gorey. And here in this film, they sort of shift the setting from Victorian to Edwardian times. And we have Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing. Kate Nelligan appears as Lucy, but essentially she's taking on the role of Mina. In a bizarre sort of twist, Mina, who's played by Jan Francis, is Van Helsing's daughter and becomes the Count's victim, returning as the undead in, frankly, one of the most memorable scenes in the film. Much like the stage play that influenced it and the iconic Universal Bela Lugosi version, the film omits Jonathan Harker's journey to Transylvania and his very eerie encounters with Dracula. There is a very significant loss there because that portion of the novel is just very rich with atmosphere and dread. Instead, here, what happens is Langella's vampire tale begins on board the doomed ship, the Demeter. The vessel crashes into the Cornwall coast, standing in for Whitby here, and from there on, the movie just sort of transitions into this sort of Bronte-esque romance tale. Langella definitely aimed to imbue his interpretation of Dracula with much more seduction than horror. He was much more interested in sort of presenting Dracula as this lonely, Byronic kind of lover who had died and yet continued to live. Personally, for me, I just prefer more of the monster to it than the lonely lover part of it. But certainly, Langella's interpretation, he's very suave, he's magnetic, and very compelling in the role. The film, despite its great production values and stunning locations, sometimes it does feel a little dull and lackluster, although it has bursts of excitement and pacing here. The climax, all set aboard the ship, the Zarzina Catherine, as it leaves port bound for Eastern Europe. Very thrilling there. Director John Badham, and this is not long before his iconic work on Saturday Night Fever. He helms the film. The score is by John Williams. It's very lush, very moody, and romantic as well. One intriguing aspect is how the film, free from sort of the limitations of the stage, it still feels confined by its choice of specific locations. While I enjoy this version, I appreciate Langella's interpretation. I just often wonder how much more engaging it could have been if it had really leaned more into the horror elements and a lot less into the laser light show. If you've seen the movie, you know the scene I'm talking about. As I mentioned before, Mina's return from the dead, oh, such an outstanding moment. Jan Francis is terrifying in those scenes. Once you see that, believe me, it's seared into your memory. These chilling moments really make you ponder how much stronger and intense the film could have been if it had sort of balanced the romantic elements with the character's more inherent savagery. I know Frank Langella has commented many times about the fact, like, no, if you want to see more of the horrific interpretations of the characters, there are lots of film versions you can go and choose. This is the one that's much more about the romance, but I can't help but wonder what it could have been if they had leaned into that just a little bit more. We're about 45 years on now, and so I think it's safe to say that, yeah, there was another direction they could have gone with this particular film. Who knows? Maybe they should have. So finally, we come to the stage to screen adaptation that really, it has to top them all. It's the original Universal 1931 film, Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. It's difficult to discuss other adaptations without mentioning this one because it was a lifeline for Universal during the Great Depression. It really helped keep the company afloat. This film not only cemented Bela Lugosi as a star, but it also really ignited the horror film boom that followed. At the time, audiences had really never seen anything quite like this, and I know it's difficult for a modern viewing audience to sort of imagine this, but the line stretched around the block in 1931 for this particular film, and everything about this interpretation of Dracula just got seared into the public imagination. Before Dracula, films had sort of dabbled in the supernatural, often ending with kind of a Scooby-Doo like ending, right? Someone is unmasked and there was some sort of heist or robbery involved in this. But here was a bona fide, genuine supernatural creature thrust up on the screens, and it was just really unlike anything that audiences had seen before. Initially, there were plans to turn Stoker's novel into this massive 4-hour epic, but of course, budget constraints led to a much more streamlined production. And despite this, all of the opening sections in the Transylvanian village and the castle, it's really unparalleled in the atmosphere and the grandeur of it all. Those castle interiors are particularly massive and atmospheric and really creating just this unforgettable setting. Bela Lugosi had already found success playing this role on stage, but he wasn't Universal's first choice. They really wanted Lon Chaney Sr., but unfortunately he passed away due to lung cancer right before they were going to go into production. And Lugosi, who was originally Hungarian and had learned his dialogue all phonetically, at least before learning English, he brought this eerie, creepy sort of charm to it. Unfortunately, it ultimately defined his entire career, but it also defined the character as well. Even now, most interpretations of Dracula are very closely tied with Lugosi's image and his voice and his mannerisms. In this adaptation, Renfield takes the place of Jonathan Harker as the solicitor who goes mad. He assists the Count in reaching the English soil, and then this film sort of shifts into the drawing room theatrics of the stage play, then straying far from Stoker's novel, but still captivating audiences nonetheless. While it's not a faithful retelling, it was the first time audiences were really introduced to Stoker's character on the big screen, creating a very lasting impact. Lugosi's portrayal is still the image most people conjure up when you think of Dracula, so that's a real testament to the film's enduring legacy. The movie was also simultaneously filmed in Spanish with a completely different cast in the evenings using the same sets, and while technically very interesting, perhaps more interesting than Todd Browning's direction, the acting, it's just not on the same level of the English language version. Over 90 years later, this version of Dracula, it really remains deeply ingrained in the public consciousness, showcasing its very significant cultural and cinematic influence. Okay, so that really brings us to our very last category, and that is the most faithful adaptation of this story. So, and faithful is probably the wrong word. I guess if you think about the novel as a concerto, this is the one that probably hits most of the notes. And that is from 1977. It is Philip Seville's BBC production of Count Dracula, starring Louis Jourdan. It really captures the mood and that creeping sense of unease of the novel better than any other adaptation that I've seen. So let's touch on the few alterations here and there. Mina and Lucy are sisters in this adaptation. It's not really that big of a deal. Frankly, in the novel, they sort of act like siblings anyway. So not that big of a change. Quincy Morris and Arthur Homewood are merged into one character. He's called Quincy P. Homewood. He is a young Texan who's working for the British Embassy. Van Helsing actually gets to finish off the Count in this particular version, which doesn't happen in the novel. And there are some minor adjustments, such as like Dracula doesn't grow younger as he continues his feedings. However, what this adaptation gets right, it's immense. The cast here is mostly just spot on. Judy Bowker is fantastic as Mina. I would say she's probably the definitive Mina, at least for me. She perfectly embodies her frailty, but also her strength. Frank Finley plays Van Helsing. He's pretty much spot on as well. He's certainly the right age, and he imbues the character with a kind of vigor and quiet intelligence. He's confident, but not cocky. There are little touches of humor that are added here and there, like he's making hot chocolate with the Bunsen burner, or he has very sly asides here and there. And Louis Jourdan plays up Dracula's more, let's say, aristocratic arrogance. He never raises his voice, he never acts viciously. Instead, he's very quiet, he's very suave, very morally ambiguous. He's using seduction to make his case. His unique portrayal includes using his cape to sort of flap his way down the castle walls in a very memorable scene. Additionally, Mr. Swales, hallelujah, he shows up in Whitby, and it's actually filmed in Whitby this time, which makes it really, really nice. Dracula's horrific act of throwing a baby to his three vampire companions, yeah, that's depicted here. And you have some characters that are often omitted, like Mr. Hawkins and Lucy's mother. At least they're included here. Now, there are some elements I know they're not going to work for especially for some modern viewers. The special effects department, boy, they had a field day with this one. Color negative, superimposed, and infrared night vision tricks. And I will say, while these effects connect to Dracula and his inversion of the quote, the normal, I can still see modern audiences finding them just super hokey. You've also got a shift from 35mm film on location to video inside the studios, and that might be jarring for viewers as well. However, I think these quirks just kind of add to the overall look and the eerie sort of quality of the production. Consider the scene where the vampire women attack Jonathan Harker. They're fawning over him. Dracula enters suddenly. There's this dazzling white light behind him. Then it sort of shifts to this grainy black and white, then back to color. He drops a bag, later revealed, of course, to hold the infant, but a quick shot of fire then suddenly follows, and he calmly just forces the women back. The high angle shot as he lifts his cape and the women rush in around him, feeling like this disjointed, eerie, unsettling kind of dance. This scene, among others, it really keeps you off balance. It makes you wonder what you just saw, and hey, if the filmmakers are going to do that, well, hey, what will they do next? There are many well thought out moments in this particular production, such as Lucy. She's in a very weak, groggy condition. She sees the men sworn to protect her, and at least in her vision, they're laughing, they're cajoling, while Dracula, who isn't even actually physically present there, he just sort of slips in among them in her vision and starts staring at her with light reflectively dancing around his face. Or when Lucy is dying, Van Helsing notices she has no reflection. Yet he's holding her hand and the bed covers support a human form. He's the only one who sees this, and he's the only one who understands the true implications of what he's seeing. These nice little touches really add a lot. It's not that those are specifically in the novel itself, but taking the very essence of what is in the novel and translating it this way, I haven't seen a lot of other films do it quite this well. At right around 2.5 hours long, this version, some people might find it really slow. I mean, if you want to see a version of Stoker's novel given a lot of care and attention, yep, this is the one. No, it's not perfect. It's not the most like fun, thrilling version of Dracula, but if you want to return to Stoker's novel, you want to see it enacted on screen, this is the version that I would choose above all the others. Well, thanks for sticking with me on this. There's probably only maybe two of you that stayed through the end of this video. So to both of you, thanks so much for hanging in there. I hope you really enjoyed taking a look at all of the different adaptations of Bram Stoker's classic and how they've made it to the screen. There were some others that I considered adding in here, but really they just strayed so far away from the original, like Jonathan Rhys Meyers, the NBC series Dracula, for example, or Penny Dreadful, or other Dracula-inspired works. They just strayed so far from the direct narrative, and I really wanted to focus more on those that were truly engaging with the heart of the novel. Each version I've covered really offers a unique lens on this sort of timeless tale, and whether it's the hauntingly faithful or the wildly reimagined, if you have a favorite Dracula adaptation or a take on Stoker's tale that you think deserves a spotlight, please let me know down in the comments below. And I guess if for some reason I've mentioned a few that you've never heard of, if you've never seen, or some of them that just sound really intriguing and you'd like to give them a watch, no matter what they are, the TV adaptations, the modern interpretations, the stage to screen adaptations, I'd say, I don't know, just put on something comfortable, something like this perhaps, where you can sit back and just be comfortable in your own crypt and have a nice glass of AB positive. So until next time, stay curious and stay scared.